so often when scholars look at the way in which Western mainstream media cover international conflicts, it is so often the case the time that they choose as the beginning of the narrative is egregiously later than when the narrative actually starts.
So today's topic of discussion is the sad and perplexing conflict we've come to know as the war in Ukraine. Often when I ponder the causes of war, I'm reminded of Smedley D. Butler's timeless remarks delivered in the 1930s about the business of war, a commentary you likely won't find on a high school or university reading list. That commentary was incredibly important and speaks to us even today, perhaps more salient than ever before. I wonder if Smedley Butler's War is a Racket, a famous speech also transcribed and reprinted, can help frame some of our discussion of war today and the various kinds of propaganda that are needed to engineer public consent to the various outrages that war brings. With me today is Oliver Boyd-Barrett, Professor Emeritus in the School of Communication at Bowling Green. In academia, Professor Boyd-Barrett's career stretches back to the late 1960s as a research assistant at Essex University and Open University in the UK. He's held numerous academic posts over decades, both in the UK at City University London and the University of Leicester, Open University, and in the US at Cal Poly Pomona and Bowling Green State in Ohio. He's authored and edited numerous scholarly books and collections on corporate media, journalism, and propaganda. Among them, The Globalization of News with Sage, Communication, Media, Globalization, and Empire, and most recently, Propaganda, Communication, and Empire, Western Intervention in Afghanistan with Routledge. The latest with Sumanth Inokonda and Lara Martin Langel. It is great to finally talk with you, Oliver. We've been going back and forth over email for years now, so it's nice to have a conversation about a topic you have been writing about feverishly over many months now. And for those who haven't yet fully unplugged from the global matrix of corporate media, can you first take us back to the beginning of the conflict? You know, how have we arrived at this situation where we find ourselves today as regards the Ukraine?
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me. It's a delight for me to actually finally converse directly with you. Although, of course, I'm very familiar with your work and very thankful, by the way, for your contribution to the volume that you just mentioned about propaganda, communication, and empire with respect to Western intervention in Afghanistan. Of course, we're opening up a huge topic here. And I hope you'll forgive me if I probably will not be sufficiently comprehensive in my response to satisfy all or perhaps even any of my peers, because this is just now so complicated and there are so many directions in which you can begin to take a conversation of this kind. But I'd like to start it off with a reflection that so often when scholars look at the way in which Western mainstream media cover international conflicts, it is so often the case that the time that they choose as the beginning of the narrative is egregiously later than when the narrative actually starts. So to illustrate that point, with respect to what I call the proxy conflict being fought by the West against Russia using Ukraine as its pretext, according to the Western mainstream narrative and also much of the official political narrative, this is a narrative that begins, a story that begins with what was relentlessly described in the opening months of this within the opening months, namely Russia's unprovoked, capital letter for every part of that word, unprovoked, Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So for Western mainstream media, this is a story that starts with an act, apparently, of egregious, aggressive invasion of a sovereign, a peaceful, peace-loving, quiet, sovereign nation of Ukraine. What could be, it's like the beginning of a pantomime. I recall as a child going to these theatrical performances, usually around Christmas in Great Britain, and the pantomimes, which were full of all kinds of vaudeville type entertainments, but they would always start with this act of evil committed by some very evil entity, and then of course the rest of that narrative would unroll. Would develop to the final successful, victorious conquest of the evil entity. So all pantomime requires an act of egregious evil, and good storytellers know that, and they repeat this formula, whether it's in the land of theater or whether it's in the land of war. Now, sorry, Daniel, so just to finish the thought, I know you probably have a follow-up question, but just to finish the thought, therefore, is that the claim that the conflict starts with this apparently totally unprovoked, totally unexpected, who could possibly have expected it? This unexpected invasion by Russia of Ukraine. That in itself is total propaganda that invites the most fraudulent of conclusions. But of course, I'm now going to argue, and I'll try to do it fairly briefly, that the conflict starts way, way before February 2026. There are many different dates at which you could set the beginning of this conflict, and that's true of most conflicts, of most acts of aggression in the world of international relations and geopolitics, have very, very long chains of cause and effect. And propaganda begins when there is a biased, purposeful choice of a given starting point over all other contenders for what the starting point is. In this case, I think many people would say, well, at the very least, we can agree that the conflict started in or around 2014, although that too is very questionable, but I find that a more helpful starting point, at least for trying to understand some of the dynamics of this conflict. What happened in 2014 was that there were significant demonstrations in the city of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, along the Maidan, and it then came to be known as the Maidan Revolution. The protests have followed what is now very apparently a script for so many of Western interventions into the sovereignty of the political domain of so many of its would-be vassal countries. And it begins, as it begins in so many other places, it begins with the appearance brought to our attention by Western mainstream media, the appearance of decent, good-looking folk protesting against, it's usually against corruption of some, nearly always it's against some form of corruption that it is being claimed is the culpability of the ruling administration of whatever country it is. And in this case, the protest is against President Yanukovych, duly elected president of a sovereign country. And the protests are, in the first place, they're against what is fairly widespread, and I think most people are quite happy to agree that there was and continues to be widespread corruption in Ukraine. The general consensus amongst sensible analysts that I know is that the extent of the corruption was pretty bad in 2014, and it's so much worse now in 2025. But the main, and again, following the script of so many similar color revolutions, this apparently fairly peaceful demonstration. It's very middle class men and women upset that Ukraine is not doesn't appear to be a transparently run economy, and all kinds of people appear to be getting rich for all kinds of unknown and probably criminal reasons. And then in the midst of this, there are more every day more. It becomes evident that there are extremist, we can call them extremist right wing, and we can call them, because they display the insignia of neo-Nazi movements, which were and for a long time have been prominent in Ukraine, although mainstream media prefer you not to know that, the nationalism in Ukraine is rooted back to the pre-Second World War movements and Second World War movements of Ukrainian nationalism, expressed obviously against the then prevailing domination of Soviet Union, of which Ukraine had become part from the time of the revolution in Russia. But these very nationalist right-wing movements had, as the trajectory of nationalist movements often happens in times of great turbulence, they seek collaboration with other forces, foreign forces, in this instance, the Nazis, and collaborate with the Nazis to the extermination of tens of thousands. Some people would put it at hundreds of thousands. I don't know. Tens of thousands, at least, of Jews, of Poles, and of Ukrainians, for want of a better term. And prime figure at this time is a gentleman called Stefan Bandera, who was then and has since become lionized by Ukrainian nationalists as a great heroic figure in the struggle for Ukrainian independence. But sadly, he has this very real history of collaboration with the Nazis. He has this very real history of participating in some of the grossest, outside of the Holocaust itself, some of the grossest war crimes that have been committed during the 20th and 21st centuries. And it is, to Stefan Bandera that the right-wing movements that appeared on the streets of Maidan in 2013 to 2014 appeared. And they appeared in great force, and they were associated with significant violence. There's a considerable debate about who was responsible for some of the acts of violence. But there is, I think, no serious analyst disputes the fact that it was the Banderite right-wing forces on the Maidan who took responsibility for taking over government buildings and for attacks on peacekeeping, or I should say, on law enforcement agencies. I don't dispute the likelihood, the possibility that the official law enforcement agencies acted with undue force. That is so often the case in these kind of events. But it is also, I think, highly likely, and we have good scholarly sources for this now, that the Banderites were responsible for the deliberate killing, murder of some of these demonstrators in order to pin the blame on the Yanukovych government. That's part of the story, Daniel, here. That all of this right-wing involvement in the movement on the Maidan in 2014 is very much obscured, if it is dealt with at all. But perhaps geopolitically, perhaps the most important aspect of this has to do with the character of President Yanukovych, who was in effect forced to flee Kiev for his own safety, because the protesters on the Maidan, having secured European and US support, when in fact the demonstrations themselves were instigated by the US and by Europe, and Victoria Nuland, who was then a leading figure in the US State Department, said publicly at the time that the United States had invested as much as $5 billion in promoting democracy in Ukraine, which most of us understand now is bringing about regime change in Ukraine. And we have, in fact, it's now a widely distributed recording of a conversation between Victoria Nuland and a European Union emissary, to the effect in which they discussed who they would put in power after Yanukovych. But initially, however, the understanding was that there would be an agreement with the Yanukovych administration for the administration to bring forward the regularly scheduled national elections. And they were not scheduled for that long in the future. It was a matter of months before the scheduled elections would have occurred. And you would have thought the most genuine Democrats would simply decide, well, we've expressed ourselves on the streets. The people now know how we feel. And now let's wait for the election, and the election will get rid of this guy that we don't like. But if you're in the regime change business, you can't take the risk of waiting for an election. There was a pretense of securing the Yanukovych administration's support for bringing forward the elections to a more immediate date. And then with that, the agreement was the demonstrators would all pack up and go home and wait for the election. But of course, that didn't happen. The capture of government buildings continued in the hands of the militia, the militants. Further threats, further violence on the streets forced Yanukovych to leave the country. And then in that vacuum, the movement took over the reins of government. It outlawed the country's leading party. So having gotten rid of the president, then they criminalized membership of the country's then largest party, the Party of the Regions, as well as the Communist Party, by the way, which was a significant party, but a minority party. And from that point on, we can say that Ukraine passed then from the status of being a standard democracy simply to being a coup d'etat, a coup regime whose appointed leader temporarily had been fingered already by the United States. And the elections were called sometime later. That led to the election as president of Poroshenko. And then again in 2019, there was a further election which shooed Volodymyr Zelensky into power. So to return to 2014, what was the key pretext that the demonstrators stood for, and to which the right-wing militia lent the hand of coercion and violence and force? It was to do with a proposed acceptance by Ukraine of a significant new, Ukraine had been in receipt of many previous loans, both from Russia and from the European Union. But there had been some consideration for some time of a massive new loan from the European Union. And there was a wide expectation that Yanukovych would accept this loan and its accompanying terms. And that's very much what the United States wanted. That's very much what the European Union wanted, because they wanted to bring Ukraine into the Western fold and to see Ukraine join NATO. Yanukovych seemed to have been going along with what seemed to be this well-established trajectory of a closer alignment between the Ukraine and the European Union, with the expectation that membership of NATO might follow. But towards in the latter months in office, he turned away from this meeting. And the common explanation for this in the Western mainstream media and probably on the streets of the Maidan was that he had been bought out in some way by Russia, by Vladimir Putin. And he was commonly described as being very pro-Russian. which I don't think is particularly fair to him. I don't think he was particularly pro-Russian. I think he was just looking for the best deal. And in effect, he came to the realization that he had a choice of two deals in essence, one from Russia, the other from the European Union, both designed to kind of keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, hopefully for long enough for it to begin to grow under its own steam, and for it to become a much more independent, a much more robust, independent nation. But on closer inspection, Yanukovych and his colleagues, I think, must have come to the conclusion that the European Union offer of a loan came with all kinds of strings and conditions and this, that, and the other, whereas the Russian offer, which was more or less for the same amount of money, but it didn't come with any conditions at all, really. And so, like a good leader, a good businessman, a good nationalist, he decided to go for the loan that was best for Ukraine. And that was the pretext, therefore, for his opposition to rise up and to follow the instructions from Washington and from Brussels to get rid of Yanukovych. Now, so we can say the conflict begins in 2014, but of course, as the months have rolled by, it's become to some people this was never a mystery. But as the months have rolled by, it's become more and more self-evident to people like myself, that really a much better starting point. It goes back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the promises that the United States made to the final president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. The promise made to Gorbachev that in return for the Soviet Union giving its consent to a Western proposal for the reunification of Germany, an enormous political event whose significance, even now, for the future of the world and for the human species, this is still of considerable relevance and importance, this reunification of Germany. Gorbachev went with it, and the main thing that he asked in return was an assurance that that NATO would not seek to any further membership from any other countries other than the new unified Germany itself.
Right.
As we now, most of us are now very much aware that promise, and yes, I attempted to be critical of the fact that Gorbachev appears never to have secured this promise in writing. I'm not sure that would have made that much difference, but it would have been helpful had he done so.
Right.
But there's plenty of evidence in my that the promises were given multiple times by the United States and by other Western actors, and that Gorbachev was justified in believing that he had secured this condition for acceptance of a reunified Germany. Which we're just, tomorrow is Victory Day. It's going to be Victory Day being celebrated in Moscow. Let's just pause for a moment and remember the importance of this, because so Russia lost people will count it in different ways, but let us just agree that Russia lost 26 million people fighting World War II. And there was an excellent article by former CIA analyst Larry Johnson in his blog yesterday, I think it was, pointing out that of all of the deaths, of German deaths, Russia was responsible for 80% of German deaths in combat. The United States and Britain killed a large number of people, of course, but they did it from the air. Not, relatively speaking, very few of them did it by combat. And in any case, no other anti-Nazi adversary lost anything remotely like the number of lives that were lost, the number of lives that were lost by Russia to win against the Nazis in World War II. This is a phenomenal achievement, a phenomenal sacrifice by Russia that has benefited, I will definitely argue, that has been of great benefit to the world in general. So given that the main adversary, the main culpable party for the agony that Russia experienced in Second World War and the enormity of the sacrifice that it was prepared to pay, Given this, Gorbachev's acceptance of the reunification was no small thing. And yes, I can imagine many people in Russia and anywhere and in other places may say, that was a questionable concession that Gorbachev was prepared to offer, but he had big ambitions. He wanted. I had the privilege of interviewing him a few years before his death, and he had a vision for Russia that would save it from what he considered, and many of his colleagues considered, to be the somewhat sclerotic, is that the correct pronunciation, state of Soviet bureaucracy. And he genuinely did believe that there was another way other than the way of that had been laid by Lenin back in 1916. He wanted it badly enough to make what deals he could with the West to make this happen and to produce what today we increasingly are calling an equitable and multipolar world. That's basically what Gorbachev wanted. And that is what he was prepared to concede on. That's the goal he was prepared to. It was so important to him that he was prepared to agree to the German reunification. So the basic storyline here then, Daniel, is of Russia having made these momentous concessions to the West, motivated, I think, in very good spirit, very genuine spirit, for an improvement in the state of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev didn't want to see the end of the Soviet Union. He wanted a continuation of the Soviet Union. I think he wanted something akin to the Chinese communist model, where the Communist Party would retain its leading status, but in a very, very different way. It's not dissimilar to how things worked in China. But the West, of course, right from the beginning, was acting in bad faith. And as soon as Clinton came along, it was very, very clear that the United States was going to push more and more strongly for the inclusion into NATO of all. The idea was that all of these former constituents of the former Soviet Union, but outside of the new but much reduced Russian Federation, all of these would become members of NATO. And then sometime around, I'm going to say 2008, it was being explicitly stated that the ambition of NATO would be that both Georgia and Ukraine would be encouraged along this path to membership of NATO. And Putin, from that period, was saying very, very strongly, very, very clearly, without any ambivalence, if you really seriously want to go down this path, we are going to have to decide whether we need to fight you to stop this. And despite these very, very clear and unambivalent statements from Putin, the waving of very, very big red flags, in other words, nonetheless, NATO and the European Union continued along the path to greater and greater expansion of NATO. And that was doubtless part of the reason why in 2014, the United States and Europe were very strongly supportive of a successful attempt to overthrow the administration of President Yanukovych, because they wanted to see Ukraine safely set on the road to secure membership of Ukraine. Now, that, I think, is the main story here, as opposed to starting it off with the invasion of the Ukraine in 2022 by Russia. Definitely we need to start it in 2014, but probably it's more helpful to start the narrative back in 1990 to 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Right.
There were multiple other causes of this conflict, however. And if we have time, and please, Daniel, don't hesitate to stop me or however you want to guide the conversation. But I'll try quickly to summarize what these other considerations were that led the Russian Federation to invade Ukraine in 2022. One, President Zelensky, who had come into office in 2019, promising that he would secure peace with Russia. Well, actually, he didn't even need to secure peace because there was already a peace agreement. It wasn't as that he had to kind of work terribly hard to bring about this peace with Russia, because there was already an agreement signed between Russia and Europe and Ukraine. And this agreement we call the Minsk. There were two Minsk agreements, but let's just call them the Minsk Accords. And one aspect of the accord, the most important element of the accords, was that Ukraine would finally agree that the oblasts, the Ukrainian eastern oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk, Ukraine would agree that it would allow these two oblasts greater autonomy. Why? Well, because these oblasts, in the light of the neo-Nazi takeover in 2014, and following the Crimean people's request, following two quite reasonably organized referenda in Crimea, the people of Crimea, I think we can fairly safely say, invited Russia to integrate Crimea into the Russian Federation. Why? Well, because the Crimea is mainly pro-Russian. They speak Russian, and they have great respect for Russian culture. Crimea includes the port of Sevastopol, most important for the Russian Navy's presence on the Black Sea. The port was, with international agreement, was leased to Russia by international agreement, including Ukraine, of course. Russia was permitted, I don't remember exactly how many thousands of Russian soldiers in the Sevastopol area. So in other words, the presence of Russia in Crimea was very strong, very, very well established. And it's of no surprise whatsoever that the Crimean people as a whole, of course, there were not everyone, but by the vast majority, were horrified when they saw what had happened in Kiev in 2014, and when they heard the kind of anti-Russian sentiments from the new generation of politicians following the departure of Yanukovych, that were signaling hatred of Russia and Russian culture and Russian language, and a determination to wipe out Russia from Ukraine. So Crimea, no surprise to anyone who knew anything about Crimea that this is what happened. But in the eastern Ukraine, in the oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk, which were also significantly pro-Russian. I mean, there's some debate about the percentages, but there's no debate about the fact that Russian language is very widely spoken in eastern Ukraine, and there's very strong pro-Russian sentiment and appreciation of Russian culture and Russian history. And following the departure, the secession of Crimea from the new Ukraine, the coup regime of Ukraine, the oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk declared themselves people's republics. They did not declare themselves independent of Ukraine. They did not go to Russia and say, please, 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 Russia, let us join you guys. And Russia didn't go to them and say, hey, would you like to be part of Russia? No, there wasn't anything. I mean, that was the last thing that Russia wanted at that point in time. It did not want it to have to take responsibility for Donetsk and Luhansk and all the kind of further international opprobrium that would cause. All they wanted was greater independence within a more federalized Ukraine. And that was the one thing that Kiev then and now absolutely refuses to concede. Therefore, before we had the Minsk Accords, which were designed to bring about an end to internal conflicts and the conflict with Russia, there had been a war, a civil war between the new regime in Kiev and the independent People's Republics. The republics won the war. How far did they win the war as a result of Russian support, overt and covert? I don't know. I think probably it was quite important, the element of Russian support that enabled the two oblasts to secure and to sustain their independence. But despite the fact that the Minsk Accords had been signed and agreed, the United States, under a gentleman called, I believe, Donald Trump, who became president of the United States in 2016, Obama had already started the process of sending further aid to Ukraine, supposedly non-lethal, but arguably towards the end of the Obama administration. The supply of aid to Ukraine was beginning to include lethal weaponry. And so Donald Trump begins the elevation of US aid to Ukraine, specifically and overtly to lethal weapons. I think the volumes were probably much more considerable than were acknowledged at the time. And I think, given that we now know that neither Ukraine nor Europe nor the United States regarded former German Chancellor admitted as much, that the Minsk Accords were never taken seriously by the West. They were regarded as a device which would give them time and give Ukraine time to rearm with a view to an eventual retaking of the oblasts or a direct confrontation with Russia. And very, very extensive US aid was leading to a very, very extensive development of highly sophisticated fortifications in the territories surrounding eastern Ukraine, with the expectation clearly that ultimately there was going to be a war with Russia. In the meantime, you had Zelensky saying that what Ukraine really, really needs now is nuclear weapons, because when the Soviet Union imploded, it was agreed that the nuclear weapons positioned in Ukraine at that time, that somehow that they were Ukrainian, but they were never they were Soviet weapons that had been made in the Soviet Union, and it was agreed that the Soviet Union should take custody of these nuclear weapons. But Zelensky made up a story about how Russia had stolen Ukrainians' nuclear safety net, and he needed the United States and Europe to help him get replaceable nuclear weapons. This, of course, was deeply disturbing to Putin, and Putin, in the course of 2021, was tried and did have direct talks with US President Joe Biden about this grave threat, because not only about the possibility of nuclear weapons going into Ukraine, but also the fact that the United States was already developing supposedly nuclear defense facilities in both Romania and Poland, which can so easily be converted into offensive nuclear weapons. Yeah. It was argued that the United States came up with the ridiculous argument that they were positioning these facilities in Romania and Poland to protect Europe against the possibility that Iran would attack Europe with nuclear weapons, which of course Iran didn't have and still doesn't have. I mean, that's a whole other story of Western invention, made up fictitious narratives to promote their geopolitical objectives. But going back to Ukraine, and this story is told very, very well, by the way, by former CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who was intimately involved in efforts during the Cold War to put a lid on the possibility of an outbreak of nuclear war. And he notes that despite the fact that Vladimir Putin had talked directly with Joe Biden about Russia's attitude towards this incredible new threat being posed by the positioning of intermediate range nuclear weapons right on Russia's borders. And, we need. We're saying to Biden, essentially, this is the moment that we just need to sit down together and kind of work out a whole new framework for European security, including our security. Not just Europe. Everyone needs security, and you can't get your security by threatening our security. That's not going to work. And Biden says he agrees. He goes along with this, but when by the end of 2021, Putin is pressuring the State Department for reassurance that these kind of talks would actually take place and would actually begin, he is then told by Antony Blinken, "Well, no, it's no, we're not going to do that. We don't have to do that. We're not going to do that." And that's a major red light to Putin. Now he knows that we're on the way to having nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and Ukraine under Zelensky is sounding very, very hostile to us, to Russia. Furthermore, Putin is monitoring the build-up of Ukrainian armed forces along the borders of Donetsk and Luhansk, protected to their rear by these immensely sophisticated fortifications that they've been building for several years on U.S. money since the signing of the Minsk Accord in 2015. So he has given the strong impression that Ukraine is poised, doubtless with U.S. and European support, to violently retrieve the oblast of Donetsk and Luhansk. And so that at that point, we get the special military operation. So going back to your very first question, Daniel, what I've been trying to do over the past few minutes is simply to illustrate the point that the causes of international relations generally begin long before the Western mainstream media tell you, that these longer stories are generally very complex and very underreported by the mainstream media.
Yeah. Hence the importance of the correct framing of an issue, or the acceptable or official framing of key issues. War has many fronts, of course, especially in the present times, with the rise of technocracy. War sees various kinds of technologies and weapons being deployed to the battlefield, as well as to the public discourse, and even to our perceptual worlds. What would war be without doublespeak and other forms of rhetorical manipulation, right? Everyone knows, of course, that war is a highly divisive topic featuring highly divisive characters. How would you describe the current situation in the Ukraine since the Trump administration has come into power? Can you please unpack the major divisions now appearing in your field of view?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And may I say that the difficulty of keeping abreast of these highly complex developments that seem to change day to day sort of make me skeptical of my own attempts to kind of write this stuff down, because I know by the time we get to tomorrow that I'm going to have to make major revisions. And in a way, therefore, one way I think of overcoming that frustration, that sort of exasperation of the impossibility of writing anything that's going to last for more than a few hours, is simply to have a conversation of a less formal character, which in a way I think is I believe is sort of more appropriate to the kind of phenomenon that we're trying to get our minds around and to understand. But when, I mean, shortly after, well, let me put it this way. So when at the end of the Biden administration, I felt fairly secure in my conclusion that what we had was a world in which the United States, which has for long been dominant geopolitically and in international relations, but was feeling nonetheless more and more threatened, more and more realizing that its dominance was could be potentially very short-lived, and therefore there were the consensus in Washington, what we can call the neocon consensus, was that the United States must struggle to sustain and to strengthen its position of dominance in world affairs. And for this reason, therefore, as was laid down by the Bush doctrine of 2003 and had been around for at least 10 years before then, and really goes back, I suppose, hundreds of years, the idea that the United States must suppress any significant source of competition to its dominance. That applied originally with the Monroe Doctrine with respect to Latin America, and then in more recent years, this doctrine is being applied across the entire world, and that's basically the Bush Doctrine of 2003. And so my conclusion, really not that radical, I don't think, by the time we got to the end of the Biden administration, was we were observing how the United States was fighting to retain its dominance, or to strengthen its dominance, by taking out, first of all, it would take out Russia, and it kind of told us how it was going to do this. It's interesting how the United States has this habit of telling everyone what it's going to do, which is an expression of its extraordinary arrogance and sense of privilege and the righteousness of U.S. exceptionalism. The Rand report in 2019 about a Rand report of 2019 called "Extending Russia" spelled it out basically that the way to control Russia would be to use Ukraine, to involve Russia in a conflict in Ukraine which it could not win, and thereby to bring about a regime change in Moscow and a weakening of the Russian Federation, and probably eventually the splitting up of the Russian Federation into a large number of small sort of statelets that could easily be controlled and manipulated and maneuvered by the United States for its own interests. So the Rand report spelled all this out very helpfully in 2019. So it was clear to me, therefore, that it seemed clear that what the United States was about was precisely provoking Russia and giving the West the opportunity it needed to apply the Rand strategy. And then we heard more and more noise during the Biden administration about the threat, the terrible threat of China, and the need for the United States to begin to defend U.S. interests against China, using both the issue of Taiwan as a pretext, the idea that the United States needs to defend Taiwan, which the United States actually legally recognized as a part of China back in the day when Nixon visited China in, I'm going to say 1971. I hope that date is correct. But more and more, the United States has encouraged Taiwan nationalism and has indicated that it will support Taiwan against any potential threat, any threat from China to secure China back into the mainland, if you will, by force. And then all kinds of issues in the South China Sea over who owns what islands, and these also are handy pretexts for justifying the initiation of hostilities between the United States and China. And then the third major, so I felt by the end of the Biden administration, we were watching the United States defend U.S. hegemony, dominance across three major fronts: Russia, using Ukraine as the pretext, China using principally Taiwan as the pretext, and in the Middle East, using Iran as the idea that Iran is a threat to Israel, and that Israel is the security of Israel is of existential importance to the United States, which of course it's nothing of the kind. But that's another mystery. But preparedness by the United States to with Israel to bring down Iran. Then Trump comes into power. And Trump talks about, he had already been talking for several months about how he was very skeptical about the conflict in Russia over Ukraine, and saying that he would be able to resolve this conflict within the first 24 hours or even before he formally took office. He was saying he would be able to resolve this conflict. And the idea began to form, not just from me, but from many people looking at this and thinking about this, and how is Trump really different from Biden? The thought has emerged that basically what Trump was trying to do is to accept the fact that United States cannot sustain its geopolitical dominance forever, that it must accept a multipolar world, not the kind of multipolar world that the BRICS nations talk about, but a kind of multipolar world which is dominated by two or three great powers, and that these powers would have spheres of interest, mainly territorially adjacent to them, over which they would exercise a sort of imperial control, if you will. So you'd end up a world divided into two or three empires. That seemed to be the kind of direction. Not particularly palatable in my view, but definitely different from the Biden plan, and of course certainly very different from the China BRICS view of what a multipolar world could look like. But now things have got further complicated, and people have been saying, with some justification, I suppose, that Trump is beginning to look a little bit like Biden. He seems unable to secure this peace over Ukraine that he seemed to think he was going to be able to achieve in the first few hours of office. And we are at a point of high uncertainty in the development of this narrative. The United States, with Trump's agreement, of course, and through the agencies of his two so-called peace envoys, General Kellogg and Steve Witkoff, have come up with ideas for peace in Ukraine. The predominant influence is that of General Kellogg, who essentially is that Russia stops where it is, that there is a kind of frozen front line, and that on the Ukrainian side of that line, there would be NATO forces, perhaps with some additional forces from other countries whose purpose would be to address violations of the peace plan. No talk of the fundamentals of the conflict, so no talk about the whole history going back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Acceptance that perhaps Ukraine does have to be neutral, at least with respect to membership of NATO, but talking about the necessity for Ukraine to have security guarantees, and to have security guarantees that would have the same degree of metal and substance as membership of NATO would, things of that kind. In short, the peace proposal has finally formalized by Trump and carried to Putin just a few days ago by Steve Witkoff, was the Kellogg plan, but amended to allow for the formal recognition, international recognition, de jure recognition of Crimea as belonging to the Russian Federation. I think the Trump administration truly did believe that this was a significant concession, and President Putin would be so pleased with with this concession. The plan, the U.S. peace plan, also was going to extend de facto recognition of Russian control over the territories that it is currently occupying in eastern Ukraine, which includes large percentages of Donetsk and Luhansk and smaller percentages of Kherson and Zaporizhia, four oblasts. These terms were, even before the peace proposal was carried to Moscow by Steve Witkoff, Zelensky, having been presented with the details on the eve of a meeting he was going to have with the Europeans in Paris, said this was utterly unacceptable to Ukraine. Even the recognition of Crimea for Zelensky was utterly unacceptable. So this was really the minimum he could do to show goodwilling for a peace settlement. That at least this is the least he could do was to allow Russia Crimea.
Right.
But he didn't. So he rejected that, and that gave Russia an opportunity to, I think, to look reasonable. Although, in fact, there's very little in the Kellogg plan that Russia was ever likely to agree to. But Russia could and did offer sufficient interest in the possibility of talks. Okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's at least get the talking started with a view to identifying a framework in which we can think about peace. What would peace look like that would satisfy Ukrainian security interests and satisfy our security interests? But that didn't appear to sit very well with Witkoff or with Trump. And then Trump was in the following days, and we're talking within the past 2 weeks, Trump was, and also Mark Rubio and Vance, were giving the strong impression that Trump was now on the verge of walking away from Ukraine. And some people were rather pleased with this because, oh, great, get the US out of this place as soon as possible, and let Russia and Ukraine hammer it out. But then, as people were thinking, just kind of wonder, so what does this really mean? Does it really mean that the United States is going to stop the flow of weapons and intelligence to Ukraine? And the answer to that question, increasingly, for a few hours at least, seemed to be, yeah, it does look like that is the way it's likely to go. But then in comes, it had been in the background for several months, but then back into the foreground of the picture came the so-called mineral rights deal, whereby initially a suggestion from Zelensky, whereby the United States would be given privileged access to mining of rare earth and other valuable minerals in Ukraine, and that the United States would benefit from this. That concept seemed to have been killed by Trump at first, because Trump was talking about a deal in which essentially the United States would end up pretty much owning all of Ukraine's mineral wealth, which that didn't sit at all well with Zelensky, of course. But just within the last few days, this new version of this deal has come forward, which seems on the face of it, you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who truly think they understand what this deal is. But on the face of it, it looks as though there's a more equitable relationship between the Ukraine and the United States as to getting access to this mineral wealth. The whole thing is highly dubious and suspicious in practically every possible respect, starting with the fact that the deal is supposed to comprise 3 documents. We've been given, through the media, we've been given sight of one of these documents, the text of one of these documents. No one truly seems to totally understand what it is. And then there are 2 other documents which there's some dispute as to whether these documents have actually been published, whether anyone beyond the small circle of people who were involved in the negotiations, whether anyone has actually ever seen these documents. But a couple of days ago, it certainly seemed to me that the documents had not been published for the benefit of members of parliament in Ukraine, in the Rada, of the Ukrainian parliament. So they had not even seen the documents. And the documents had not been seen by anyone in most countries of the world. There were some indications that they had been seen in one or two capitals. So we don't know what's in these documents. But what does seem to come out of this is that the United States has made some form of agreement with Ukraine that there's going to be some kind of investment fund that will allow the United States to invest in Ukraine and to benefit from exploitation of Ukraine's mineral wealth and to share with Ukraine the proceeds from these investments. This does too, well, I should also point out that the document does allow for the possibility that were the United States to give more weapons to Ukraine, then these weapons would be recognized as the equivalent of investments in this fund. So even if no one else in the United States invested in this fund, the mere fact of a continuation of a flow of weapons from the United States to Ukraine, they would count as though they were actually investments. And that the American people, if they were foolish enough to believe any of this, could expect that at some date, some way off in the future, finally, the United States would be paid back for its beneficence in giving away its wealth to the people of Ukraine.
I can't find any of this in the corporate media.
There are useful articles in the Financial Times. So I don't want to give the impression that this is not covered at all. I think there's great interest in it, actually, particularly within financial and economic circles. But as I say, there's very little understanding, and there's a lot of indications. And I think this is becoming, as this week goes on, indeed, there's, I think, increasing acceptance and in some quarters worry that what this deal does is it brings the United States back into Ukraine. That even if the United States doesn't have to put its own U.S. forces on the ground in order to protect these investments, at any moment, maybe a false flag operation from Ukraine or from one of the European powers, the Baltic states or anything, quickly the United States would have to rush armaments or even its own U.S. military onto the ground in Ukraine to protect these. And so I think this is what Russia is now seeing. I think Russia is seeing many things. It's trying so hard to be reasonable and not to close any doors. And yet it's faced with the evidence that the United States foreign policy is totally inconsistent as far as Russia can see. It's totally incoherent. It's totally untrustworthy. That Trump himself is all of these things, particularly untrustworthy. So no sane administration in any country will want to deal with this guy. I don't think that's how Russia saw the situation 2 or 3 weeks ago even. But I do suspect that is increasingly how the situation is being regarded in Moscow now. It doesn't mean, now Trump and Vance, they're both saying that they both come back from saying that the United States was going to walk away. And now they're saying, well, we've done as much as we can do. And now it's up to these guys, Russia and Ukraine, to sit down and sort it out. And we'll be watching and seeing what's happening, and we'll act accordingly. Well, the problem with that was so many problems. This is where we are right now, I think. This is the best sense I can make of the situation. It's where we are. So one, the United States continues to posture as though it's a mediator between two naughty boys who are having a little fracas in the playground, in the school playground, and here the United States is the headmaster and is going to try and bring peace between these two countries. And but of course that's a total absurdity, because the United States, I would argue, is the primary belligerent, not Ukraine. I think the United States is the primary belligerent in this conflict. as indicated, as I mentioned a moment ago, by the RAND report of 2019. So the United States cannot be truly a mediator in this conflict. The second source of the absurdity of the situation in which we are is that Zelensky, in 2022, in October of 2022, he forced through the Rada a decree that said that no Ukrainian can legally enter into negotiation with Russia, particularly Russia still under the presidency of Vladimir Putin. And even now, Zelensky has not lifted that decree. And also, as we've just seen, Zelensky has shown unwilling to make even the most minimal concession to secure what he says he wants to secure, namely, well, he wants to secure a ceasefire, but he's not prepared even to make the minimal concession that would help to bring about even a ceasefire, let alone a settlement. And then on the other hand, Putin, who has been playing a very, very straight hand throughout the entire conflict. You may remember in 2022, just a month after the beginning of hostilities, there were peace talks in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia. And Russia at that time would have Russia's main point at that time was to ensure that Ukraine would never join NATO. And I think, had he got that, plus one or two other smaller things, I think that would have been sufficient. And anyway, an agreement was signed, and the text of that agreement is available for those who would like to inspect it. So Zelensky, on the urging of Boris Johnson, who was really acting on behalf of Washington, sabotaged that 2022 agreement. Since then, Putin's conditions for peace have hardened. They're much harder now than they were in 2022. So that's the first mistake the West made, is not just accepting the terms that were already agreed in principle, in draft form, were already agreed in Istanbul in 22. And then after many indications of where his mind was, Putin on the 14th of June in 2024, less than a year ago, in other words, spelled it out. These are our conditions. Our conditions are Crimea, of course, the 4 oblasts that have already been formally integrated into the Russian Federation, even though Russia doesn't yet occupy the full territory of the 4 oblasts, but together with demilitarization, some ceiling or some lid on the strength of Ukrainian forces, let's call it demilitarization, and also denazification, which I think principally means a criminalization of the membership of neo-Nazi parties in Ukraine. Also, the need for the respect and dignity of Russian language and Russian culture throughout the entirety of Ukraine. These such things as the expulsion of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was very strong in Ukraine. It's now a criminal. It's a criminal, or it's a terrorist organization, apparently, from a Ukrainian point of view. So all of these things, this cancel Russia culture, that's got to stop. That's what Putin says. These are his terms, and those who know Russia and Russian negotiating strategies much better than I do advise me that this is how Russia behaves. Russia tells you what its terms are. It doesn't. It's not inviting you to consider, well, are these minimalist terms? Are they maximalist terms? No. This is what they are, and this is where Russia will stand until those terms are achieved. So, given the present circumstances, I think we should conclude very reasonably that no peace is possible. No ceasefire is possible even. Why? Because Russia insists that the first thing that is needed is a framework for talking about peace. And that includes an investigation into the root causes of the conflict. And neither Ukraine nor any part of Europe nor the United States wants to talk about this kind of stuff, because they know they can't talk about this stuff without exposing their own history of bad faith. And so therefore, Russia's position is we have to talk about how to talk before we have a ceasefire. Because if we just start with a ceasefire, we know for a fact, we look at what happened with the Minsk Accords, we know you guys are just going to use the time to rearm Ukraine and at any point of your choosing in the near future to start the whole war again. Well, we're not going to do that again, is pretty much what Russia's message to the West is. So there is definitely a deadlock, but it's a deadlock in which, for most of the time, I think it's fair to say that Russia is winning the war. I know that some people are reluctant to concede that Russia is winning the war because it's not winning it very fast. I think too many of us have Hollywood type ideas about the speed at which wars can be won. And first of all, they don't understand the reality of war. Second of all, they don't understand the realities of a war fought along a 1,000-kilometer front. And thirdly, they don't understand what it's like to fight a war in the drone era. But so you take all these things into consideration. To my mind, it's undeniable that Russia has made significant advances and that Russia every day is making small advances, which over periods of time lead to bigger advances. And if Russia is winning the war, there's really no very good reason for Russia to do anything other than simply to hold its ground and to keep insisting on Putin's conditions of June the 14th, 2024. The only surprise in my mind, or to my mind, is not so much surprise, but it's I am concerned that there may be a potential misreading of Putin here. Because sure, Putin is sticking to his conditions of last year, and I think he is sincere. I think if Ukraine genuinely wanted to enter into negotiations with Russia right now, Putin would not go beyond the conditions he's already set. But allow this war to continue for X number of weeks or X number of months, it's inevitable, to my mind, that Russia would extend its conditions. And we kind of know how that's going to happen. We know that Russia is already, Putin has said many times, he considers Odessa essentially to be Russian. And I think Russia is very likely to extend its conditions to include Odessa and to include the Black Sea coast up to the Romanian border. It also seems highly likely. In fact, I can't understand why Russia is not already saying it has to have Kharkiv as a matter of its own security. And I also think it's quite likely that it would want to include Kiev itself, and it would want to include all of the territory to the east of the Dnieper River. And I think this is very important, I think it would want to include all of the cities along the Dnieper, those cities which extend over both the east and the west banks of the river Dnieper. I don't think you can take halves of cities. I don't think that works very well. And I think if Russia is truly interested, as of course it is, in its own security, Europe keeps on talking about Ukrainian security, but the problem is that Russia wants its own security to be its need for security to be respected and recognized and acknowledged by the West. That's never happened up until now. And I think those security needs, if we're being logical about it, includes, as I say, all of the territory up to the Dnieper and also all of the territory of the cities that are on both banks of the river Dnieper, like Kherson, for example, or Dnipro, or the city of Zaporizhia.
Wow. So what do you think? Do you think we can do perhaps some speculation, some prognostications? Is it possible to foresee, given this dynamic situation we find ourselves in, to project what we might see in the future?
Well, I mean, if I'm honest, Daniel, I think the answer is no, you can't really. But let's try. And if I'm to try, I would be very intrigued by the appearance that the United States is giving of being ready to remain caught up in the Ukrainian imbroglio through the mineral rights agreement. So I'm thinking that this does signify the likelihood of a continuing flow of US weapons and intelligence to Ukraine, that's not going to stop the war. That's going to continue the war, and it'll probably escalate the war. Now, what that does, this gets very interesting, because the United States, it doesn't formally admit this, but a number of very well-credentialed military analysts will say this, that United States stocks of weaponry they're depleted. They have been attrited, in other words. This war against Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, is often described as a war of attrition. And it's a war of attrition. Apparently, military experts will say that wars of attrition are they're won by the power that has the most resources, that can hang out the longest. In this instance, therefore, Russia is stronger, much stronger. And Russia is attriting Ukraine ever so gradually, ever so lacking in drama. It's attriting Ukraine, succeeding in doing that. But the most important or the most interesting aspect of this is that Russia is attriting the West. I don't believe for one moment that Russia set out with this intention, but Russia is attriting the West. It's depleting European stockpiles of weapons, by the way, which haven't really proven very successful on the battlefield anyway. And it's also attriting United States stocks. I mean, we are now in the absurd position from a United States point of view of saying to Ukraine, okay, so you guys want some more air defenses. You like these Patriot missile batteries and missiles. Right. So, Israel's got one. It can probably spare. There's another one sitting in Germany somewhere. Yeah, we'll get the Germans to send you one of those. Yeah. They're out of stock. It's pathetic. And they are not out of. They are out of stock with respect to the Patriot batteries, and they're out of stock with respect to the missiles that those batteries fire. The West has been attrited at a time when the rhetoric is suggesting that the United States is very strategically and very wisely deciding to retreat from Ukraine because it wants to focus its attention and military prowess on the threat of China, which is said to be the far greater threat to the United States. With what weapons then, United States, are you going to fight this war with China? And I guess Trump's response is, we're going to fight it economically. We're going to bring them down economically. Well, we're seeing right now just how implausible that particular strategy is. And just yesterday, we learned that the United States went to China to ask for a meeting with China to begin to talk about the tariffs. The United States and the West in general has a losing hand. Russia and China, China just by itself, China has a manufacturing capability, including a weapons manufacturing capability that totally exceeds the entirety of anything that the West can show itself capable of. And then China and Russia together, of course, and with North Korea and some other countries, the balance is weighted even more against the United States. We're seeing this every day more. We saw it just again in this week in the supposed battle against the Houthis in Yemen, which is said to be a ceasefire, but it's only a ceasefire in terms of the Houthi agreeing not to attack United States ships in the Red Sea. Is continuing to target airports and such in Israel. But the basic point I'm trying to make is the fact that the United States initiated a deal with the Houthis suggests to me and to others that the United States is not even confident about keeping the Houthis under control. The Houthis, with their own missiles, they're not totally dependent by any means on Iran, as is so frequently claimed. With their own missiles, they've taken down 7 Reaper drones. They have taken down at least 2 FA-18 fighter jets. They have hit the Harry Truman aircraft carrier in the Red Sea. they pretty much stopped the flow of international trade through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And the only time that they're going to stop, apparently, is when Israel stops its genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And the Houthis, of course, are the only country that has had that has stood up heroically in defense of the Palestinians against genocide.
What's the importance of asymmetrical warfare? Perhaps we can talk about that again in a follow-up interview.
Of course, you're very welcome.
That would be wonderful. We can have another interview. I mean, it's I'd like to thank you so much for the time you've taken out, and I hope that we can have another talk much sooner rather than later.
Of course. And also, Danny, I must apologize. Next time we meet, I obviously need to have a glass of water close to hand. And when I talk at this length, I clearly need some lubrication. My apologies to you.
Excellent talk. I really appreciate it.
And you, Daniel, thank you so much.